Hey there, and welcome to this chapter, Photoshop for Web Design. Here we'll use the tools you've just learned in real-life situations. I don't expect you to know all these tools by heart at this point, but we're going to practice constantly until you get used to all these techniques. From this point on, we're going to use a special .psd file which will help us create every single website design. One option is to go to www.960.gs. Hit the download button and then extract the files. Go into templates/photoshop/960_grid_24_col.psd, and you can use that. I have a slightly modified version that you can get from your resources folder, and I recommend you use that one. It's named 960px Grid System. Copy it to your desktop and use it throughout the course. Something to note is that every designer works differently given that Photoshop allows multiple ways of achieving the same result. Use whatever technique suits you. Using Photoshop for web designing purposes doesn't require a very creative nature, but more of an analytical, even mathematical approach. In order for you to become a great web designer, I believe you will need speed, efficiency, and knowledge. Speed is the first step because if you strive on being more efficient and knowledgeable, you want to do so in the shortest amount of time possible. That's because it doesn't matter how good you are if it takes you forever to achieve your result. As you create more and more projects, you will discover questions and subsequently answers. You will see more and learn more. So I strongly suggest you make a conscious effort to become faster. Going to the efficiency aspect, it doesn't matter how fast you are if you're going through unnecessary steps. You have to constantly choose the best path in order to achieve your result. This is a major challenge because it ties up with the other two aspects. You want to be as fast as possible, but you also have to be constantly thinking what's the best option for the next task at hand. And the only way to achieve that is with knowledge. As you learn different techniques, hotkeys, and principles, you get a better understanding of Photoshop. As your knowledge grows, so does your creativity, in the sense that you're no longer asking, how can I do that? But instead, what's the best way to do that? Plus, you eliminate a major potential problem. If you have speed and you're efficient in creating different graphical elements, it doesn't mean that they'll all magically fit together. You have to understand design principles so as to make your design flow. Every element you put in your website must go well together with the rest of your graphics in order to create a certain effect through your page. Otherwise, though you'll have great individual elements, your clients will say something doesn't click or it just doesn't feel right. Thus, the triad is complete, and as you can see, each area is very dependent on the others. You can have only one or two of them mastered. You need all three for a solid foundation. What I will show you next is how to create graphical elements like navigation bars, slideshow areas, search bars, galleries, and much more, while showcasing different techniques and hotkeys. The purpose is for you to get accustomed even more with the tools we will constantly use, and to see the steps I go through when designing actual elements. Then, you can practice and create your own elements while constantly increasing your speed. This is your main goal for the moment. Then, we'll see how all of these fit together in a website design. So, let's get started. Best practices. The first step you need to master is moving around within a project. To do this well, you must completely understand and apply a few things I consider best practices. Always keep one hand on your keyboard and one on your mouse. Never let a hand sit idle, because this means you won't be able to use hotkeys. I recommend you keep your feet flat on the floor, work at a desk, and keep both hands on your peripherals. This applies even if you have a laptop, so please don't work in your bed or while lounging on the couch. Always know on which layer you're on. If you don't have the proper layer selected, it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you don't know where you're at, just take a look at the Layers panel. The active layer is always highlighted. Also, if you want to select a layer, do it from the canvas with a Control-click so you're keeping your focus on the task at hand and not scrolling through tens of layers in the Layers panel. Always use your hotkeys. If you want to go back a step, don't use the menu up top. Instead, use Control-Z. I know this seems like common knowledge, but these little things will make the difference in cutting down the hours from 3 to maybe 2.5 while working on a project. Always go back to the Move tool by pressing V. Since you're constantly arranging things on the canvas, this is the best habit you can possibly have. Whether it's text, a shape, or a graphical element, you'll surely need to either move it, align it in some way, center it, reposition it, etc. So always press V. Always group your layers and rename them. Every few minutes or so, I take a few seconds to double-click on a layer's name, rename it, use Control to select multiple layers, and then group them by using Control-G. You won't believe how easy your life will become if you use this simple technique. Understanding the alignment tools. The alignment tools up top work differently based on what you have selected. These tools need two elements to compare their positioning to each other. Let's say you have an object selected. No tool is available, and this is because it has nothing to compare it to. If you use the Marquee tool and drag a shape, then press V, you'll notice a few tools are now available. Now, you can tell Photoshop to position your object based on the selection you've just made. You can center it horizontally, for example, or vertically. You get the idea. Your layer acts as the first element and the selection as your second element. If you have two objects and you have them both selected, of course they will align according to their positions. Let's see what happens when we vertically align them. Pretty good. Let's use the horizontal tools too. As you can see, all the tools move one object in conjunction with the other. But what about when you want to center two objects on the screen? If you just select them and hit Align Horizontal Centers, they will just center themselves. And this is because you didn't give Photoshop the proper command. You just said, hey, I want to take these two objects and put them in the center. If you stop right there, Photoshop sees you have two objects selected, so it will assume you want to center them amongst themselves. What you need to say is, I want to take these two objects and put them in the center of the screen. In order to do that, we need to group the two objects into a folder. That will become our first element. Then select the entire screen as the second element. We do that with Control-A. So again, we have two things selected, the entire canvas and a group. Press Align Horizontal Centers and Photoshop will do just that. If we have three items selected, we'll have additional alignment tools up top. The icons really tell the story, and they're very simple to understand once you see them in action. Let's get these three objects to have the same space between them. To do that, having them selected, we'll press Distribute Horizontal Centers. If we want to achieve the same result, but vertically, we need to press Distribute Vertical Centers. These are the two you'll most likely use in web design. Once you have separated your objects correctly, you might want to align them in the horizontal center of the screen. To do that, group them, select the group, select the canvas, and use Distribute Horizontal Centers. You need to practice these concepts so you know how to move and align objects with precision and in a fast and efficient way. This is probably the most important thing you need to master at this moment, so I've prepared an exercise file for you. It's the only exercise in the entire course, so you have no reason to skip it. Let's go. Now it's time for an exercise. Let's get to it. Open layers-folders.psd. Your task is to arrange the shapes from the shortest to the tallest, group them into folders by their color, and have them all sitting on the same base and having the same distance between them. Now, pause and give it a try. You have an image of how your project should look at the end. Use that as a guide. Please pause and have a go at it, because the next video will be me making that exercise. Solving the layers-folders.psd exercise. Open up the project file and read the task and tips. First, I will select all the objects from the Layers panel. Select the first or the last, then using Shift, select the other end. Then go to the top panel and hit Align Bottom Edges. Then hit Distribute Horizontal Centers. They're a bit bunched up, so let's move one of the extremes more to the side. Use Control-Click to deselect all the layers by selecting the canvas. Then, select and move an extreme. Use the command again, and you'll see they're more spaced out. Deselect again. Hold Shift and start arranging them by color. Using Shift will make your objects move only in straight lines. Remember to always use Shift and/or Control to quickly select or deselect one or more objects. Good. Now they're all matched up by color and sitting on the same base. Now let's arrange them by height. Select them all and space them out again if needed. Now we need to center them on the screen, so let's hit Ctrl-G, then Ctrl-A, align horizontal centers, and we're almost done. Press Ctrl-D to deselect. Move the entire folder up, and now let's group them by color. Select them one by one using Ctrl-Click, then Ctrl-Shift-Click, then hit Ctrl-G. Double-click on the name to rename the folder. This one is Red. Now continue with the rest, group, and rename. If you move one by accident, just hit Ctrl-Z. Now select all the folders and move them out of the initial folder, delete that one, go to File, Save As, name it Solved Layers Folders, and we're done. Great. You'll probably be slow at first, but do this a couple of times and you'll get the hang of it. Creating a main menu. To create a main menu, first open up your 960 grid file from your desktop. Now let's show the guides with Ctrl-semicolon so we know how wide our menu should be. Then lock them with Ctrl-Alt-semicolon so we don't move them by accident. Just in case that happens, press Ctrl-Z to undo. Select the rounded rectangle tool. I'm using the hotkey U and Shift-U to scroll through the other shapes and adjust the radius to 4 pixels. The bigger the radius, the rounder the shape will be. At 4 pixels, it's almost square, so there will be a subtle roundness to the menu. Make sure you have Align Edges checked. Choose a blue color from the left side. Now start from the left side and drag all the way to the other side, giving the shape a decent height. Close the guides with Ctrl-semicolon. Now press Ctrl-A and center the shape by using Align Horizontal Centers, just to be sure you have it perfectly in the middle. We need to check if the edges of the shape touch the outer guides, so we need to zoom in real close. Press Z and zoom in. If the menu isn't as wide as it should be, align it to one side, then press A for the Direct Selection tool to resize the shape. Start from the inside and drag out. Hold Shift and do the same for the other corner. Now go to the edge and drag. Hold Shift to make sure you drag in a perfect line. Why are we using this technique and not Ctrl-T and drag? Well, we have round corners, and if we do that, the corner radius will no longer be 4 pixels and the shape will lose its nice roundness. Let me exaggerate a case so you can perfectly understand why this is necessary. I'll make another shape, make a copy of it, and use Ctrl-T to drag and expand. I think it's pretty obvious that the Ctrl-T method is far worse. Now we have our basic shape, and we need to add some text. Press T to select the Type tool, and here we have another thing you should always keep in mind. If you go over the shape, you'll notice this cursor with a round shape to it. Click, and you'll write inside the shape. This isn't the way to go. You should click outside the shape, right, and move it into place. Or you can use a somewhat complicated hotkey, which is Ctrl-Shift-H, and then you can write over the shape. Check the cursor after you've used the hotkey. Now the symbol is no longer a circle, but a square. You might think that remembering Ctrl-Shift-H is quite complicated, but in CS6 you really need to use it because of the following reason. Let's say we have this shape here, and we want to add a light gray stroke to it. We'll go to the FX panel, like I like to call it, and select Stroke. Get a light gray, set the size to 1 pixel, and as you can see, well, actually as you can't see, the stroke isn't clearly shown because of that highlighting action. To get rid of it, of course, you need to use Ctrl-Shift-H. Getting back to the text, write a couple of items and have 1 space between each of them. After you've set them all, go at the end of the item, press space a couple of times, select the empty space, and then paste it between the other elements. This is how you make sure you have the same space between each menu item. Use the Enter button from the right side of your keyboard to commit the changes. Select both layers by using Control and center them by height or vertically. The vast majority of menus start from the left side to the right, so you don't need to center the text horizontally. The text is looking very basic at this point, so open the Character panel. You should have it on the right side, but if not, just go to Windows, Character. Here, let's set the font to Arial, bold, 16 pixels, white, with a sharp anti-aliasing. As time goes by, you'll use better fonts, but for now, we'll keep it simple. One thing to note is that navigation items should have small type. As a rule of thumb, Arial 16 is pretty good, or Arial 13 with all caps is another good way to go. The mistake most designers make is setting the font to something like 30 pixels. Having the text small makes the element more elegant. Of course, we don't want to hinder the visibility in any way, so this is why we always use strong, contrasting colors. For example, never use a yellow background with white text. In this case, although it wouldn't look that good, black would be the best option contrast-wise. This is why I generally recommend you stick with fairly dark background colors and pure white text. When you're in the color picker, make sure you click and drag all the way into the top left corner to select white. Its code is FFF. Make sure you don't pick something around that value since coders will look for an exact color code when implementing your design. Now let's make the menu look nicer. First, let's add a gradient from the FX panel. You can either create your own, or you can use a predefined one that you got from the web. Let me show you a quick way to get a nice, simple gradient. We have blue as our foreground color. Go to Gradient, click and select the first one. Go to the other end, click on the small icon, and select the same blue, only make it lighter. Now we have a nice 3D effect, which is dead simple to make. Let's go to Stroke, and again, we'll select the existing blue, only maybe a slightly darker shade. The size should be 1 pixel, and it should be on the outside of the shape. Now, we'll go to Bevel and Emboss, and we'll get overwhelmed by all the options. Funny thing, we only need to change the size from 5 to 2 pixels, and instead of black, we need to change this color to blue. Easy and no headaches. Of course, you could do a bunch of other things here, but that goes for almost every tool in Photoshop. Make sure you always close the styles attached to a layer by pressing on this icon. A good thing to know is if you have multiple layers with effects on them, you can select them all. Press the arrow, and all of them will either collapse or expand. Now that our menu is starting to catch life, we need to add some separators between the menu items. This is optional if your items are very far apart from one another. The technique is quite simple. Select the Line tool from the left panel, make sure the weight is set to 1 pixel, zoom in real close, and drag a vertical line from the top of the menu to the bottom. Change the color to black, duplicate the shape by pressing Ctrl-J, press V, and move it 1 pixel to the right. Change the color to white. Now drag the opacity all the way down to about 10 or 20%. The dark line is usually more close to 10%, while the light one is more close to 20%. Of course, these percentages really change based on your background, so what you need to do is to adjust them according to what you see. What we want to do is create a separation effect, a line that cuts through the menu. Usually, it's best to zoom in and out to make sure you're doing the right thing. After you're happy with it, select both lines and group them with Ctrl-G. It goes without saying that you should constantly rename your layers and groups. The only exception is the text layers. Now we have one separator, and we need to center it between 2 menu items. We'll press M for the Marquee tool, and make sure we have the square one selected and not the round one. Zoom in real close, and drag a shape between 2 items. Then press V, and if you have the separator group selected, you should be able to center it by using this tool. Now we have our first separator done. We need to do the same for each item, so to speed things up, we'll use Alt-Shift and drag. What this does is duplicate the group while moving it in a straight line. After each one, you should center it. When everything is done, group all the separators into one folder and call that, go figure, Separators. To give it that extra edge, let's get a cursor from iconfinder.com and drag it into our project. Let's create the hover state for an item. To do that, press T and select an item. Go to the Character panel, and let's change its color to something that shows the hover state. Something like this, maybe. Get the Marquee tool by pressing M and drag a shape like this, between two separators. Now go to the bottom, next to the FX panel you already know and love, and press this small icon. Here we'll use an adjustment layer, but don't worry about the name, just select Brightness and Contrast. This menu will appear, and all we need to do is adjust the brightness, either up or down. Play with it to get a hover state for your menu. You can do the same thing for the down state, which shows the page you're currently on. Let's say we're on the home page, so we'll just use Alt, Shift, and drag and copy this effect. Only this time, we'll make it the opposite of the hover state. I like to make the down state darker and the hover state lighter. Rename as always, and we have a great-looking main menu. But just in case you want extra visibility for your text, select its layer, go to the FX panel, and select Drop Shadow. Here, I recommend you use something along these settings. 1 to 2 pixels for distance, 1 to 2 pixels for size, and color-wise, you should go for a darker color than the background has. In this case, a darker blue. You can play with the opacity and make the shadow more or less obvious. And there you go. With a few simple techniques, you get a good-looking main menu. And you've just learned a bunch of hotkeys, do's and don'ts. Of course, this is only one type of main menu, but it's probably one of the most common menus you'll make in your projects. Be sure to practice, practice, practice. Creating a search box. A search box is something every website should have, and it's quite an easy graphical element to create. We're going to make a simple, minimal search box that can be adjusted to fit different types of menus or sidebars. First, we'll select the round rectangle tool, and we'll set the radius to something in the area of 5 pixels. Make sure it's white, and deselect the edges with Ctrl-Shift-H if it's needed. Then we'll go to the FX panel, and we'll get a nice light gray stroke. Strokes are a nice way to get to learn your grays. By now, I know by heart some good grays like D9, 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 or EB, EB, EB. What I suggest is you take a look at what grays good-looking websites use, and you can easily copy them by using the Color Picker tool on a print screen. So let's set our gray for our search box. Again, the size is 1 pixel, and the stroke is on the outside. Now we can add the slightest white to gray gradient, just to give it a bit of an edge. And to get that 3D look, we're going to select Inner Shadow. 2 pixels distance, 4 pixel size, and 20% opacity is a winning combination more often than not. Let's move on to the text aspect. This search box will be something similar to Google, a live search box, which basically means as you type, some suggestions appear. Let's write the name of someone in Arial, 14, and set the color to a fairly light gray like 555. Then select the first couple of letters, make them bold, and change the color to black. Now it's starting to look good. Let's go to iconfinder.com and look for a loading icon. Download it by pressing the PNG text, and you'll have it in your download folder. I made a setting in Chrome to download everything on my desktop so I can easily access them. Drag it into Photoshop, and if needed, press Ctrl-T to resize. A nice trick is to use Shift to maintain proportions. This way the object doesn't get all stretched out. An even better trick is to use Alt-Shift while dragging, which resizes the object from all parts. Looking good so far. Now for the drop-down. Get the round rectangle tool and draw something the same width as the field above, but taller. Now type in a couple of names that resemble the one up top. Even better, use Alt-Shift and drag to duplicate that layer. Make sure you have it selected first. As you drag, you might need to change the positioning of the layer from the right side so as to not be hidden behind the shape you previously drew. Let's have 3 names in total. For the shape you made, change the shape color to white. If needed, add a subtle gray stroke and a drop shadow. The settings should be something you can play with depending on the context of your design. Now to finish it off, let's add a couple of lines to separate each name. Select the Line tool and drag from one side to the other. If needed, double-click the line to adjust the color. And that's our clean search box. Of course, you can integrate this within a menu bar and you can adjust the colors to match the color scheme. Another great thing is that you can right-click the field, select Copy Layer Styles, create a more rounded shape, right-click that, and select Paste Layer Style. This way, you can choose from a 5 pixels field or a 15 pixel field or whatever you want, and you don't have to go through the process each time. Make sure you practice. Black and white photos. This is a dead simple technique, but very good to know. Open up an image in Photoshop. Then go to the Adjustments icon at the bottom, and then select Black and White. And that's it! One thing to note is that if you have this area selected, which is called a mask, your colors from the left side change to black and white. To understand why, grab a brush and start painting. Black adds color, white removes it. This way you can easily make certain areas stand out. Black and white images usually show that the element is not active or selected. This is great when creating thumbnails, for example. So keep this in mind when you want to give your design a bit of an edge. Have fun! Pimp your backgrounds. Are you tired of the same old plain colors or predefined gradients? What can you do to create a nice background? Well, let's run down some of the techniques on how you can take your backgrounds to another level. We'll start off with a blue rectangle and convert it to a smart object. First thing we can do is go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. A panel will appear which has a lot of options you can play with. Let's make a couple of adjustments so you can clearly see what they do. You'll notice that you have a drop-down with a couple of options. My favorite preset is the point effect. You have 2 others, but I think this is the best way to go for web design purposes. You have a lot of options here, and it's best that you play with them to achieve the effect you're looking for. Note that you can change the color or something else so you don't have to go back a few steps in order to reset. Let's say we're happy with the result and commit to the changes. If we want further adjustments, we can go to the Layers panel and double-click on Lighting Effects under Smart Filters. This will reopen the panel, and you'll get to make even more adjustments. Now let's go to Filter, Noise. This will add a small texture effect to the background, but be warned that anything above 2 or 2.5% is too much. I usually go for 1 to 1.5%, uniform and monochromatic. Another easy way to pimp up your background is to add a pattern overlay from the FX panel. What's more important is you have a couple of patterns in Photoshop and adjust the opacity level. If you don't have patterns at this point, don't worry. I'll show you how you can get some resources later on. The opacity of the pattern heavily depends on the colors and the effects already applied, so be sure to adjust based on what you see and not on certain percentages. The final twist is in the blending mode of your patterns. From normal, just browse through the other blending modes. While adjusting the opacity, I usually use the scroll on my mouse to go through them quickly. You can also change the pattern, and you'll see a very wide range of options appearing for your graphical element. I hope you'll try at least some of these options and take your backgrounds to another level. Forget about simple gradients and solid colors. These are fun and have a high visual impact. Clipping masks. This is something I use in all my designs, no exceptions. So, what's a clipping mask? The best way to understand it is to see it in action. We'll draw 2 shapes on the screen, and while we're on the top layer, we'll press Ctrl-Alt-G to create a clipping mask. Notice what happens. Only a part of the top shape is visible, the area which intersects with the bottom layer. This is great when you want to constrain an image within a certain shape or size. This works great when creating thumbnails. Let's say we have a background like so, and we want some pictures displayed in gallery fashion. So, how should we proceed? Well, first we'll draw a rectangle and add a stroke to it. Adjust the color based on your background color. Now let's grab an image from our desktop and drag it into Photoshop. Adjust the position of the image, make sure it's above our shape, and press Ctrl-Alt-G. Now the image is constrained to that shape and size. If needed, we can press Ctrl-T and adjust the image size so it fits better. This is great when you only want to show a small part of an image. We can then group these two layers with Ctrl-G and then use the Alt-Shift-Drag technique to duplicate it. Afterwards, we can use Distribute Horizontal Centers and we'll have the basis of a nice gallery. Then we can select the second thumbnail and drag another image into place. Adjust it if needed, and be sure to remove the previous image since we don't need it anymore. Repeat until you have replaced all the images. To make the thumbnail look even nicer, we can duplicate the initial shape, which I like to call the outer image holder, use Ctrl-T, and make it small by using Alt and Shift. The idea is to have an empty space of 2 to 3 pixels that will act like a frame. Depending on the image, we might want to adjust the stroke or remove it completely. Usually this frame gives the thumbnail a bit more of a presence. One last thing we can do is to add a small drop shadow to the outer image folder. Go to the FX panel, select Drop Shadow, and play with the settings until you find a nice, subtle shadow. And there you have it. Remember to always use Ctrl-Alt-G, but just in case you forget, you can right-click on a layer and select Create Clipping Mask. Paper Sheet Effect. Let's learn a simple yet powerful technique regarding shadows. We already know how to use the Gaussian blur filter effect, but let's see where else we can use it. We'll use the rectangle tool to create a shape. Now, let's just add a background of some sort with a pattern or a gradient. To make our shape look like a piece of paper, we could use the drop shadow effect, but I find that's not optimal. A better option is to get the rectangle tool, drag a wide, short shape, and place it underneath the piece of paper. Now use the Gaussian blur from Filter, Blur, and lower the opacity a bit. Nothing special so far, right? Now grab the elliptical marquee tool and drag a selection similar to this. Now press Delete, and voila! The sheet of paper appears to be curled. Of course, you might need to adjust the opacity to make sure it looks right. Let's undo with Ctrl-Z, and we'll use this feather option up top. This will have a very interesting effect, and to showcase it, I'll use an exaggerated figure. Now drag the selection, press Delete, and notice there's a softening of the edges. That's what feathering does, and as you increase the pixel count, the more feathered it will be. After you're happy with the top shadow, you can duplicate it. Drag it at the bottom, press Ctrl-T, and flip it vertically. A nice and fast way to create a better shadow. But what happens if you want to add these shadows to the side? Well, first let's get our rounded rectangle tool and drag 2 shapes, one on each side. Then either make them a smart object or merge them. Now that you've done that, we can make sure they are completely centered on the screen. This is really the best way to go about it. Now, as usual, use the Gaussian blur option and lower the opacity. It looks good like this, and you may leave it as is, but just in case you're looking for more, you can use the elliptical marquee tool and delete a part of it. Depending on how curled you want your page to look like, adjust the selection width. I recommend you keep it quite thin since that's how it looks best. Want to make sure you have the exact same selection on the other side? Move it by using Shift and one of your keyboard arrows. Using Shift just makes it go faster. Be sure to have the marquee tool selected and not the Move tool. Otherwise, your selection will move with part of that layer. So, that's how you create a nice paper sheet effect. Create a slider with a shadow. A slider is usually the main gallery component of a website that occupies the top central area. It's also known as the hero area since it's usually the most important, but it can also be called the main banner or slideshow area. The purpose of the slider is to create a high impact and long-lasting impression. Usually it contains some call to action. For example, a certain discount on a product. So let's create one. Get the round rectangle tool and draw a shape as wide as the website. How wide, you ask? Open up the guides with Control, semicolon, and you'll have the answer. Now let's add a light gray stroke to it and maybe a gradient of some sort that will make your text stand out. Once we have that set, let's press T and write our headline. The text should be fairly big and it should say something like Amazing Headline Text. Or we can adjust the font from the character panel, and I generally recommend a bold font. Now let's add a drop shadow, but make sure you use a color that's a bit darker than the background. Black is usually too powerful. After you're happy with that, we'll create a second line of text which will have 2 to 3 lines of the offer description. We'll use Lipsum.com to get some filler text. Lorem ipsum is widely used in the web design business, and it's just Latin text. Better to use that than just pressing randomly on your keyboard. The font size should be smaller than the headline, but still decently big, somewhere in the area of 16 to 20 pixels. So we have our text component and a decent background, and now let's add a nice icon. For that, we'll go to iconfinder.com and select an icon that's big enough to use. I'll adjust the filter in order to get only big icons. Once you're happy with one, download it, drag it into place, and we're set. Since this is a slider, it will, slide. So that means there will be multiple images. For that, we'll need some controlling elements so you can go back and forth. First, we'll add some arrows to the sides. Instead of using simple icons, I will drag a black rectangle, and then from the custom shape, I will select an arrow, which I will set to white. Adjust the size if needed with Ctrl-T, put it into place, and make sure the arrow is centered inside the rectangle. Now group, duplicate, Ctrl-T, flip horizontally. Now we're getting somewhere. Usually slides don't load instantly, so let's have an icon that represents that. Go to iconfinder.com and search for loading. This icon is great, but we want it in white since it will have better visibility. Go to the FX panel, go to Color Overlay, and instead of the default red, use white. Use Ctrl-T to resize if needed. So we're almost done with our lovely slider, so let's add some final elements to it. Draw a black rectangle at the bottom of it. Now select the round rectangle tool, set the radius to 5 pixels, and draw this shape. Then select the ellipse tool and make a few circles. They should all be white, except one, which should be blue to represent that that's the active one. And now we should clean our layers up, rename, group, hide layers if needed. As an extra topping, let's make a lovely shadow for it. We'll make a rectangle. Use the Gaussian blur effect and lower the opacity and move the layer underneath our slider. Then, to give it a twist, hit Ctrl-T and select Perspective. Now drag while holding Shift, and you'll see this gives the slider a very 3D aspect. And now we're done. Of course, there are many types of sliders, and you can experiment with lots of shadows and graphics, perspectives, and so forth, but make sure to make some of your own. Stock photo on multiply blending mode. Let's say you have a nice slider like I have here. Though you might think it's white, if you look closely, you'll actually see it has a gray gradient applied. Now, more often than not, you'll have to use stock photos in this JPEG form. This means that they will have a white background, and although you can remove it, it's sometimes difficult and time-consuming to do. A simple way to go about this is to select the image, go up top, change the normal blending mode to multiply, and voila, the image now looks good without any white background. You can also try darkening as an alternative. This is great for certain colors, but usually only for light backgrounds. If you try it on a dark background, it just won't look good. Have fun! Better pictures. Want better sliders, better thumbnails, better pictures overall? Well, usually stock images already look pretty good since they're usually adjusted and balanced, but sometimes you might use pictures from a free website like sxc.hu, and if that's the case, those look pretty bland. A dead simple yet efficient solution is to increase the saturation of the image. Bright, vivid pictures always look better. To do that, just add an adjustment layer from the bottom of the Layers panel and select Hue and Saturation. A new panel will appear, and what you need to do is raise the saturation with 10 to 20%. It really depends on the image at hand, so make sure you adjust it as you see fit. Again, dead simple, but very effective. Highlighting the logo. Fact is, sometimes you don't get logos in the proper format, and you'll be forced to either remove the white background or change the blending mode to multiply. If you choose the latter, you'll notice that the logo seems darker and doesn't stand out as it should. A simple way to fix this is to create a small highlight behind it. So let's select the brush tool and create a new layer that will position behind the logo layer. Now adjust the brush size so it will create a highlight a bit bigger than the logo. I always use my square brackets to adjust the size, but if you want to do it another way, you can just click on the icon and adjust it from here. The other setting we need to change is the hardness. We'll set it at 0%, so when we use the brush, it will create a very soft highlight. Click, and that's it. Your logo stands out a bit more. You might want to adjust the opacity depending on the background, but that's the main idea behind it. Using the Marquee tool. Besides the Move tool, the Marquee tool is something you'll constantly use and for different reasons. First of all, in CS6, you can use it to make measurements. Press M to select the rectangular marquee, and now click and drag. You'll see some measurements will appear that represent the width and height of your selection. This is great because A, symmetry is extremely important in web design, and B, you don't have to constantly switch to the ruler tool. So a real-world situation would be this. We have a background, our content area is delimited, and you want to have a slider, but of course you need some spacing on each side. To make sure you have it set up well, just zoom in and use the Marquee tool. Check on the one side, then do the same for the other. That's one use. The second use is to align elements, and you have already seen this in action when setting menu separators. You have your layer selected, you're on the Marquee tool, and you make a selection. Then you press V to change the Move tool and use the alignment tools from up top. Of course, you can also use the elliptical Marquee tool to create a paper sheet effect like we saw previously. But even more interesting is the fact that you can use this tool for some uncommon situations. For example, let's say a client asks you to improve his font on his current website and especially in the call to action buttons. Now, instead of recreating those buttons, which is hard enough if they have some fine details to them, you can use the Marquee tool to erase the text and use another at its place. First, you need to make a print screen by pressing the Print Screen button on your keyboard. Then, create a new project file in Photoshop by pressing Ctrl-N. Press Ctrl-V to paste your screenshot and zoom in on your button. Now get the rectangular Marquee tool and make a small selection, as tall as the text, and press Ctrl-T. Drag the handle and the font will disappear. This is one way of doing it with the Marquee tool. The other fast way you should know now is to select the text with the Marquee tool and press Shift F5 and select Content Aware. This does almost the same thing. Going back to the Marquee tool in our print screen layer, you can also make a selection of that button, then press Ctrl-J to make a copy of it. Now if you move it, you'll see your button will be on a new layer. This is also good when you want to increase the size of an element that's not created by you. So for example, a table like this, if you want to make it wider, you can use the Marquee tool to select the edge, Move it outwards, then make a selection on the interior, press Ctrl-T, and drag it. Results vary depending on your image. Saving your progress with a 960 grid file, tips, and a few tricks. Though I have a very strong computer, Photoshop still crashes from time to time. Most of the issues happen when updating drivers, for example, for my video card. In an ideal world, your computer would be rock solid, but as we know, that's not the case. So we need to adapt, and that means we need to save often. Here's what I recommend. First, have your 960 grid file on your desktop since you'll use it nonstop. Then have a folder named Photoshop Projects on your hard drive, and create a shortcut to that folder on your desktop so you can easily access it. As you start up a new project, open up the 960 grid file, add any element to it, and then immediately go to the File menu and press Save As. That's not save, there's a big difference. If you use save, you'll overwrite your 960 grid file, and the next time you want to use it, you can't, since it will have all the layers you made for another project. So after you made a couple of items on your canvas, be sure to use Save As and save your progress in the Photoshop Projects folder on your hard drive. After you do that, constantly hit Ctrl-S every few minutes, even though CS6 has an autosave function every 5 minutes. Next, you'll realize as the projects stack up in your folder, you might want to reuse elements from the past. A very fast and efficient way to preview your PSDs is to add an image to your project folders. Rename it as 1.jpg and have ACDC installed. ACDC is a very popular image viewer, and it has a free version. Then, when you want to preview your projects, just open up 1.jpg and use your arrows to browse through. This is dead simple, doesn't require a lot of resources, and it's very fast. Another thing I recommend is you create another folder inside Photoshop Projects named Resources, or, something like that. Here you should stockpile all sorts of stock photos, icon sets, textures, and so forth when you need something. You could just look through this folder instead of browsing on the web. One last thing I would recommend as you progress in your web design is to invest in a cloud storage system. I use Google Drive, for example. What this does is it uploads your files to the internet and keeps them safe in case your hard drive dies, for example. It's also nice if you're working on different computers. Imagine if I were to lose 500 PSDs and tens of gigabytes of resources I've collected over the years. What would be the financial loss of that? Awesome. So I pay $10 every month for this service, and I strongly recommend it as you go along. How to adjust your canvas size. I know beginners might have a problem with this, so better said than not. Let's say you're creating a very long website, and you need more space on the bottom area. To enlarge your canvas, go to Image, Canvas Size. Now take a look at the left-hand side and see where you're at right now, and estimate how many pixels you'll need. Let's say I want an extra 300. So go and add 300 pixels to the height, but what's important is you click on the up arrow. If you don't, Photoshop will add 150 pixels to the top and 150 to the bottom, and that's not what we want. This is the most common resize you'll use, so keep in mind, use the up arrow. The same thing goes when you want to shrink your canvas, an apparent simple thing that might cause problems for some. Defining a pattern from an image. Sometimes when you search for resources, you might see patterns or gradients that have this icon. To add them to Photoshop, you need to double-click them, but sometimes instead of getting a pattern in this format, you might download something like this, an image. To use that as a pattern in Photoshop, you need to hit Ctrl-O, then select the image. Then go to the Edit menu up top and select Define Pattern. Hit OK, and now when you open up your FX panel, your new pattern will be there with the name you've chosen. Layer styles. In my time using Photoshop, I've rarely used layer styles because I think they make you work less than you should actually be experimenting and discovering new combinations. Open up the Styles box by going to Window, Styles. I already have mine docked next to Paths. The idea is you create the shape of a button, then use a predefined style that automatically adds all sorts of effects. This obviously saves you time because you don't have to select your own gradient, adjust the bevel, the satin levels, etc. So I don't recommend you download too many from the internet. One thing to note is that if you design an amazing blue button, what you can do is save that and reuse it. To save a style, just click once in the Styles panel, choose a name, and that's it. Again, don't use this option too much, as it takes away from your creativity. And instead of creating a button that fits your design, you wind up wasting time by looking for one that looks decent and somewhat fits.